we're just here for it at this point. I am walking back to the library today. Today is Thursday, so because I'm only doing these once a week, I kind of have to keep track of like which days are which. But I'm heading back over to campus to do some work. I was pretty productive. Well, actually, I was really productive last night. I read until like 6 or so, and I got into the Voight text. I got into the Hillman text, which I think I went over yesterday. And yeah, so it was good. Now you guys are getting a view of my walk to campus. Yesterday it was a view my walk from campus. So this is Stillwater. And yeah, so I have one of the Brenda Hillman texts with me. Then I have Wild by Design by Laura Martin, which I started yesterday. I read the introduction yesterday, and so I'm going to get into the first chapter, which I will say, I didn't really talk about that book much, but I did talk about her background, how she's an ecologist, but she was bridging into the history of ecology to bring the humanities into the sciences, but she doesn't talk about like the literary aspect and like the importance of literature in there. So I'm like excited to enter the conversation from that point. But I didn't talk about this. She discusses the ethics of ecological restoration, because there's a push for those who are restoring the ecology of specific areas, or like, you know, globally, are like, there's this argument of like starting the restoration before a certain group of people, mainly colonialists, had invaded an area, and how that is unethical because they are performing erasure on Native and Aboriginal peoples who inhabited the lands prior to white colonialists. So I'm excited. One of my areas of expertise is ecofeminism, and so this like leads right into that type of conversation. So I'm really looking forward to reading Martin's take on that. And yeah, Hillman is interesting so far. I mentioned that the book I have is signed, which I'm pumped about. And then the Voight text, I only read to like the first few pages, but I like Voight. So those are the 3 I have today. I'm gonna finish Hillman because again, I'm doing the Seeley challenge. There's also another challenge for other writers who are watching this. So I can't remember who it's organized by. I mean, we all kind of like do it on our own regardless, right? But there's another challenge where every day, like coupling with the Seeley challenge, every day in August, you're supposed to submit to a journal, or basically have 30 submissions in the month of August, which I submitted to, I think, 4 journals yesterday, plus a chapbook contest. And it's actually kind of a lot, but I'm gonna do my best to also adhere to that challenge. Oh my God, that guy just scared me. And yeah, I will check in. I don't know if I'll check in later today, maybe tomorrow, sometime at some point in the next week. See you guys later. Over a week since it's now Friday of the next week, so I was like, I better post something, or I better get something together. So I have made a lot of progress in the past week. I finished 7 books. I finished In a Few Minutes Before Later by Brenda Hillman. I finished Seasonal Works with Letters on Fire by Brenda Hillman. Hillman is a really interesting author. The Seasonal Works with Letters on Fire is an older text, and A Few Minutes Before Later, I believe, is in her newest text. And she says that she doesn't like being considered an activist poet, but a lot of her work revolves around civil and environmental rights that we see being challenged and diminished in our current America. So I enjoyed reading her. I did think her type of writing is a little wild, like how she messes a lot with grammar and with punctuation. And I think that she's someone, I think I mentioned previous to this that I was considering utilizing her work for the presentation that I have to give for this exam I'm preparing for. And after finishing those two texts, I have another text I need to read by her as well for my exam list, but I like her work, and there are other poets who I think I would do a better job presenting on, if that makes any sense. Like, I also finished Apocalypso by Evelyn Reilly. I love Evelyn Reilly's work. I think that she's making, most of these poets are just making these monumental moves within the craft to illuminate and exhibit kind of what's happening, like what the speaker is witnessing in terms of like environmental collapse is also written into the craft that they are exhibiting on the page a lot of the times. And I resonate, I think, better with Evelyn Reilly's work. That being said, I also finished Lighthead by Terrance Hayes. And if anyone who's watching this is familiar with Hayes' work, so I mentioned a while back, I read Ordinary Beast by Nicole Seeley, just an out-of-this-world poet. Terrance Hayes is the same type of poet, where his work is just on a completely different level. And whenever I read Hayes, I always am inspired. He's one of those those poets who I read where I'm reading not only just like the content and the context, but how he utilizes form, how he utilizes craft, the moves that he's making within the poems is just so exceptional that I was also thinking like, man, maybe I should do my presentation on Terrance Hayes because he's amazing. But then I also finished Hayes, so Lighthead is about social justice in America. A lot of it focuses on social justice in America, but I also noticed a lot of elements on the relation to nature from a Black person's perspective, which I may have mentioned this. So in my literature exam focus was in ecofeminism. I've also mentioned that one of my areas of expertise is in ecofeminism. And something as being a white person that I wasn't privy to before I started studying for that exam is that my relationship to nature is much different from a Black person's relationship to nature, or a Native person's relationship to nature, or a Latinx person's relationship to nature. And depending on the culture and the ethnicity your relationship changes to nature, and environmentalism looks different depending on that. So that I think, I noticed some of that in Hayes' work. So that was, I'm thinking about that too. But then I read Eye Level by Jenny Xie, I think is how you pronounce her last name. It's Xie. And I finished it. So today's Friday. I finished this collection, I think on Monday or Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, I went to an orientation because it's orientation week at Oklahoma State this week. And then yesterday, I flew to Utah. So I'm currently in Utah for my grandfather's 90th birthday tomorrow. And because of that, I was up at 2:30 yesterday. I got into Utah by 9 a.m. and it's all been kind of a blur. So I'll have to make a mental note, or I'll have to make a written note to come back to you on what Z's collection was about, because I'm sure that I can remember if I sit here and ponder long enough, and I don't want this film or this literary excerpt to be too long. But so I finished those 5 texts, and then I also finished a text called Jāltok. I am unsure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's by a Marshallese author, Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner. Also unsure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that collection was, Jetnil-Kijiner is currently completing her PhD, and she lives between the Marshall Islands and Oregon, I believe, and she writes a lot about not only what happened on the Marshall Islands during when America was testing nuclear or atomic bombs. They went to these islands to test atomic bombs and completely disregarded the 90,000 Marshallese islanders who lived there. And so now there's a history of cancer that is continuously proliferating each generation and killing children through it's just the radioactive, their genes have been altered from the radioactivity of the atomic bombs. And she also writes about how the global warming is the effect of global warming on these islands, and how in America, when we say, a 2-degree increase in the world is what we want to stay under, or aim for 1.5 degrees under, we don't want to go above that 1.5 degrees. And she talks from a perspective where 1.5 degrees warmer is actually catastrophic, because these islands are literally sinking back into the ocean, and people inhabit these islands. So she's bringing that perspective of environmentalism that is not Americans. Most people on the bigger continents don't even think about this, right? And Hawaii is a part of America, or one of the American states, but I really haven't read a whole lot of, I'm not privy to knowledge on if Hawaii is sinking back into the ocean. So it's something to consider how the global warming and climate change is affecting those who are not on the larger continents. And then I also finished a collection called Hotel Almighty by Sarah Sloat. And Sloat, she talks about in the introduction of this book, it's a collection of erasure. And she says that the book came about from a writing activity that she did with a writing group, where they were given a book and they had to go through the entire book and basically perform an erasure to create their own poems. And I thought it was I thought it was a cool idea and a cool workshop idea. And I kind of came to the conclusion that entire book is just kind of a cool workshop idea. She mentions that there's no real linear storyline happening throughout this. It's just kind of supposed to be taken, washed over you, which is fine. It's fun to read. It's fun to look at. And I don't think it has, I'm thinking about that text in forms of craft more than I am in terms, informing craft instead of informing the theory or the craft that she's actually using, I would use her approach to that method to maybe describe how someone else performs erasure on something else, if that makes sense. But it's a pretty book. So, and sometimes with these, oftentimes with these lists, you will have books that really hit the nail on the head. And then other books where you're I don't know how I got to this book and put it on my list, but I did, and so here we are. And, okay, so that's everything that I finished. While I'm in Utah, I have been reading Icelight This is by Ranjit Hoskote, who is actually a writer from Bombay, I believe. So this is another one where he was published by an American press. He was published by Wesleyan University Press. And so maybe I probably should have dug a little deeper, because mostly I focus on American literature. But it's fine. It's because like global warming and environmentalism is a world issue, not just an American issue. So it's good to have this perspective as well. And then I have not finished the Martin text, though I will say, as I've been reading this, it's interesting in terms of history. And I think that this text would best be used as like a brief scaffolding for any type of question that I am preparing for on my exam. I don't think this is really going to be a text that I really dwell in. Although it's interesting. It is interesting. And then the flexible lyric collection or craft book I've been reading, I'm still reading it. Sometimes I just really knock it out of the park with my theory and craft text, and other times I knock it out of the park with poetry, and I kind of did that with poetry last week, so what can I say? But I've also brought some other books that I brought. Again, I don't know if I'm going to get through all these. I just brought them so that basically I have a large stack in front of me, and I know that I can't just mess around while I'm in Utah, so this is like a working vacation. But I brought Kingdom on Amalia by Araceli Germain. I'm almost positive, so I think this is a new collection, and I think that this won an award. Oh, this is not a new collection. I take back everything I just said. I'm still excited to read it, but I brought that. I have Bone Light by Orlando White, and then I brought Bionic Communalities by Brenda Ijima. I've read a lot of her theory. She's a brilliant woman. And then I brought Suddenly We by Evie Shockley, who also wrote Semi-Automatic, a great collection. Then I brought This Compost by Jed Razula, which this is kind of a collection of essays of ecological imperatives in American poetry. So he's tying together more of like what I've been reading with like the Bait text and the Morton text. These are all the theory texts. And the other one that I read the other week that my brain is blanking on. And then I also brought The Art of Syntax by Voight, which I've actually read this book before, but I wanted to do a refresher. And then I brought The Transmission of Affect by Teresa Brennan to bridge into the affect theories. So a lot of theory, quite a few craft books. Constantly trying to catch up, and yeah, I'll do a little time lapse so I stay focused and I get through some books before my family comes home, and then I get nothing done. I should come in. I'm gonna wrap this up for this week and post this, but I finished 2 more poetry collections. I finished the Hoskote collection, and I finished the Orlando White collection, Bone Light. The Hoskote Icelight was really interesting. I mean, so my geography is not great when it comes to South Asia, like this region. And I said that Hoskote was from Bombay, and I am unsure if Bombay is in India because Hoskote is from India. So it was really interesting to look at it. There was quite a bit of interaction between the speaker and the environment. And I noticed that the speaker was often taking the role as creator. And there was also, like, Hinduism comes up a lot in this collection, which is interesting because reading American literature, what we see most often is like a form of Christianity that's coming up in the literature. So that was interesting to read a collection based from like a different religious grounding. Then the white text, Bone Light, was phenomenal. Highly recommend. So Orlando White is a Dene author, and this collection was about the assimilation of language into like the standardized American English language, as the speaker being Dene. And White utilizes grammar rules, punctuation, and formulates it in a way that is like dismantles the speaker but then reassembles the speaker, but there's pieces that are missing, right? And there's echoes that are missing. So it was really a phenomenal collection to read, and I was very pleased that I found that incidentally. I'm thinking of ways to tie that into the environmental conversation because it's really about assimilation of language. I mean, but you have like, you can really tie anything into anything as long as you have the proof behind it. But I don't know. I have to think about the ethics behind tying that in there. We'll see. And beyond that, I've made more. I'm like halfway through this Martin text, and I am planning to finish that later tonight, which means that I'm in speed reading at this point because it is, again, a lot of historical context, which she does go over the bombing of the Marshall Islands, which was tied to that collection that I talked about earlier. And yeah, so I'm gonna probably skim through a few of these other chapters to see if the information that's being provided would be helpful in the scaffolding for the collected or the creative works that and the theoretical text that I'm reading through. And that's about it for this past week. So that's 9. I'm going to count this one as 10. That's not bad. And I'm going to keep reading this weekend. So see you guys next week. I prematurely ended that. I wanted to give a shout out. I have a few new followers. Thanks for coming along on this literary journey. And I hope you enjoy and have fun. This is good for me to do this, so I am constantly thinking about and talking about the work that I'm reading and what I'll have to write about here in a few months. And yeah, I'm so happy y'all are here. And if you guys have questions, let me know in the comments. If you have suggestions, let me know. And I mean, I was more in depth with my summaries to begin with in this series because I was doing it every single day. And then that became too much for me to do. So now it's more of a brief overview of each text. But yeah, if you guys have questions, let me know.